Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is human biology, and we are on the digestive system, chapter 19. What about Adam? We will be talking about Adam in class. So let's start out with the general structure and function. The digestive tract itself is a continuous passageway, which is the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and then the rectum and the anus. There are also accessory organs, which are necessary parts of the digestive system but are not part of the digestive tract. These include the tongue, the teeth, salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So what about the function of the digestive system? So every cell needs a constant supply of nutrients, and the digestive system does quite a bit to make that happen. First off, cells use energy contained in the nutrients. So your cells can use chemical building blocks in the nutrients to rearrange and make what is needed for the body. For example, if you eat some protein, but it's not the exact protein your body needs, it can break it down and then use the amino acids to make the protein that it needs. Digestion. So let's talk about the major processes of digestion. Process by which digested food is broken down because food is too big to enter the cells. You can't get a piece of cereal and put it into the cell. It has to be broken down into smaller particles. Absorption is another step where the nutrients must be transferred from the digestive tract to the circulatory system and brought to cells everywhere in the body. And finally, elimination. The waste material must leave the body. Okay, let's take a look at the whole process. You don't have to write this down, but you should be paying attention to what's going on, and then we'll go through each step more closely. So ingestion is taking in food through the mouth, and that would happen here. And then next is propulsion, and that happens. That's the movement of food. First thing is swallowing, and then peristalsis. So you can see it happens throughout the system. Then there's also mechanical digestion, which is chewing, churning in the stomach, and mixing by segmentation in the intestines. So you've got some chewing in the mouth, churning in the stomach, and then segmentation in the intestines. And that is physically breaking down the food. Another step in the digestive process is chemical digestion, and that uses enzymes, and that happens in the small intestine. And then there is the absorption of nutrients, the transport of digested end products into blood and lymph in the walls of the digestive canal, and that is going to happen in the small intestine. And finally, defecation or elimination, which is getting rid of all the undigested substances from the body as feces. Okay, so let's talk about the organs of the digestive tract. Some terms you may hear are the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract or the GI tract, and those all are the same thing. Okay, starting with the mouth. Ingestion is the process that occurs in the mouth, the process of receiving food. Mastication is when the teeth mechanically break down the food. And the food mixes with saliva, which starts chemical digestion, and the food is moved to the pharynx. Let's take a look at our picture. So the food would be ingested in the mouth. Mastication, mechanical digestion would occur with the teeth. The tongue would be involved in propelling the food into the pharynx. So moving on to the pharynx. This is commonly referred to as the throat, and it consists of the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. And the oropharynx is what you can see, and that houses your tonsils. So when swallowing, the tongue pushes a bolus, which is a small portion of chewed food that has been mixed with saliva, into the pharynx. And so the food is now called a bolus. The swallowing reflex pushes the bolus to the esophagus. So if you remember, in the respiratory system, we were talking about the trachea, and now we're going to be talking about posterior to the trachea, the esophagus. So a little bit of interest in involuntary reflex action. So part of swallowing is voluntary and part of it is involuntary. Your tongue raises to seal the back of the oral cavity and the soft palate, and then the uvula is raised to prevent food from entering the nasal cavity, and then the epiglottis covers, so the larynx will come up and the epiglottis will go down, and that will cover the trachea, so the food and fluids go down the esophagus and not down the trachea or up your nose. Okay, from the pharynx we're moving on to the esophagus, which is about a 10-inch long muscular tube, and it moves food from the pharynx to the stomach using peristalsis. And if you remember, peristalsis is an alternating contraction of smooth muscle. The esophagus will also secrete mucus. And why do you think the esophagus secretes mucus? It descends through the thorax. It is anterior, in front of, so anterior to the vertebral column and posterior to the trachea. So it's in between the vertebral column and the trachea. Another interesting fact is heartburn occurs when stomach acid gets into the esophagus. The esophageal sphincter usually prevents this, so there is a problem with the esophageal sphincter if you have heartburn. So looking at your esophagus, it is a long muscular tube. And as you can see, this is all very muscular, and it is only open all the way when food is going down there. And there are several layers of muscle. The esophagus brings us to the stomach, which is a J-shaped muscular organ in the upper abdomen. The stomach will store food and mechanically and chemically digest food. Now, the food is no longer called food, it's no longer called a bolus, it is now called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. So the stomach will secrete mucus to protect the stomach lining. It will also secrete hydrochloric acid that helps kill pathogens, and also it helps denature proteins, which means it unfolds them so they are ready to be digested. And the stomach also secretes pepsin, which is an enzyme that digests proteins. And taking a look here is our stomach in the upper abdomen. It is a J-shaped muscular bag. And fun fact, pepsin, perhaps you remember pepsin as one of our proteins from biology, and maybe it was even your protein. So the stomach, looking more closely at the stomach, is inferior to the diaphragm. So here's our diaphragm, and then it is inferior to the diaphragm. It is anterior, so in front of the spleen and the pancreas, which are hiding back there. And it is tucked under the lower left margin of the liver. So it is underneath the patient's left side of the liver. So how big is your stomach? The capacity is about 1.5 liters. Its maximum capacity is 4 liters or a gallon. Don't try the milk challenge, you will lose. Sphincters control food coming into the stomach, up here from the esophagus, and leaving the stomach going into the small intestine. Okay, so we are now at the small intestine. This is where a lot of the magic happens. It is where almost all of the chemical digestion occurs. and almost all absorption of nutrients occurs in the small intestine. So the pyloric sphincter of the stomach will open and let a small amount of chyme, which we know is the name for food now, into the small intestine at a time. Glands in the small intestine secrete a lot of mucus to protect the small intestine from acidic chyme. So taking a look here, we have our stomach, and then the pyloric sphincter would allow a little bit of chyme to go into the small intestine. So the small intestine receives many things besides just the chyme. It receives bile from the gallbladder via the bile duct to help digest fats, and we will talk a little bit more about that later. But here's your gallbladder, and then here is the bile duct, which goes into the beginning of the small intestine, and it is receiving bile. And bile will help digest fats because it will emulsify them and allow them to be broken down. The small intestine also receives enzymes via the pancreatic duct from the pancreas, and these help in digestion. So the enzymes, most of the enzymes needed to digest your food are made in the pancreas and then secreted into the small intestines, where your small intestines chemically digest your food. So at this point, the food or chyme really kind of slows down its movement. So it moves slowly by muscle contractions through the small intestine, and this often takes about 3 to 6 hours for the food to move through. So we do want it to move slowly so that a lot of chemical digestion can occur, because the enzymes need to get in there and break down the food into nutrients. So your small intestine also needs to absorb those nutrients. So it absorbs carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, water, vitamins, and minerals. So the small intestine is designed for its job, which is absorption, which means it's going to have a lot of surface area. The small intestine has a huge surface area. For one, it is very long. It is about 6 meters long. So let's look at some pictures of the small intestine. Also, the lining of the intestinal wall has circular folds and finger-like projections called villi to increase the surface area. So it has a long length, it has circular folds. If you can see, here are what are considered circular folds. And then those circular folds have villi, and here's a picture of our villi, which really increase the surface area to absorb nutrients. And then the villi have villi. So if we look at the villi, they have microvilli, which further increases the surface area for absorption. If you remember, Hank Green said that your small intestine would have the texture of velvet. So there is a nice picture of your small intestine on page 436 in your book, and in class we're going to look at CPUP, a simulation you did in biology that talked about intestinal cells. Okay, looking at some pictures of the small intestine. The villi are made of what type of tissue? They're made of epithelial cells, which are good for absorption, because that is the name of the game in the small intestine. So each villus, which is singular for villi, has blood vessels where the nutrients pass into the bloodstream and are brought to the tissues. So you can see the red and blue blood vessels are picking up the nutrients and bringing them where you need them. Also, each villus has a lacteal, which is, as you remember, part of the lymphatic system, and that is where fats are absorbed, and then they go into the lymph, which eventually goes into the bloodstream. So next up is the large intestine, and we are going to pause there, and we'll talk about it in the next video, but that is our last stop before leaving the body. Okay, see you next time.